Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, one of the frustrations that you and I have about studying China-Africa relations as closely as we do is when we see a lot of the research and the Western media coverage. Actually, I'll even extend it beyond the Western media coverage, the international media coverage that talks about the Chinese. They oftentimes talk about the Chinese as if they're in some kind of vacuum. And so they isolate the Chinese experience in Africa from everybody else's. We see this, for example, in labor relations. We've seen it in the kind of some of the disturbances in some of the factories and the mines. We see it in ethnic relations in different African communities. And while what the Chinese are doing is important, without that important context, it is extremely difficult to really understand how do the Chinese fit within the broader story in the context of African society.
You also have the same problem in African media coverage of Chinese migration to Africa, where the Chinese situation, the Chinese, the case of Chinese people are frequently seen in this kind of isolation of, are they integrating enough? Are they doing this? Are they doing that? Will they be in the long term, will they become part of the society? Without taking into account the complexity of African societies themselves and how many other minorities are also actually living in African societies at the moment.
And now for the first time that I have seen, after almost a decade now of studying China-Africa relations, I'm seeing the first research that's coming out that actually puts the Chinese experience in places like Zambia into a broader ethnic and social context. And that research is coming from Lu Yao, who is a master's candidate in social sciences at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. For some of you who have been following our show, that, of course, is the university where scholars Barry Soutman and Yen Hairong come from. And Lu Yao has written this really interesting paper called Chinese Integration and Perceptions in Zambia in Comparison with Caucasians and Indians. Lu Yao, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. Good evening.
And I think before we get started on a discussion about your fascinating paper, the one that both Cobus and I really enjoyed reading, I think it's important to kind of talk a little bit about your own personal backstory. You yourself have a very personal connection to Zambia that extends beyond just your scholarly work that you're doing there and your research that you're doing there. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of your connections to Zambia?
Yes, of course. My mom is a medical doctor, and she served as part of the medical team, and she went there in 1994. And after she finished her term, she fell in love with Zambia. So our whole family decided to move there in 1998. So I grew up in Zambia, and I have a Zambian education from primary to all the way to secondary school.
So that no doubt kind of framed how you did your research. So let's get into the heart of what you are talking about. And the core of your paper was to put the Chinese experience into a broader ethnic context in Zambia, right? Right.
Well, from a lot of when the China-Africa discourse sort of started, and I was going to university in the U.S., and every year I come back to visit family, and I feel the difference of how I am perceived in the Zambian society year by year. It changes because when you grow up in a country, and you are not very sensitive to the ethnic relations, and neither is your hosting people. I've always felt that I was part of Zambia, but soon, around the time of 2010, 11, 12, I would go down the streets, and people would be talking things to me, and it's not a very comfortable experience, but it seems that something was happening, and everyone with a Chinese face was, despite how long they've spent in Zambia, what they're doing, they're slowly being singled out, and it's a very unique experience. So that's sort of one of the reasons why I want to put the Chinese people back into the whole diverse picture in Zambia.
Was that moment of being singled out, was that a particular due to a particular moment in Zambian politics at that moment, or do you feel that is just becoming more and more acute as time goes on?
I think the moment was in synchronized with Mr. Michael Sata's his political campaigns because I went back to Zambia in 2012, and I recall some particular incidents while I was there, but I don't know when people who spent their whole period in Zambia, when their moment started.
Let me just put a little bit of context there for folks. For those of you not familiar with Michael Sata, he's the former president, the late president of Zambia, known as King Cobra. He kind of built a lot of his popularity in the later years of his political life rallying against the Chinese. In fact, he was, for a long time, the most vocal critic of the Chinese in Africa. In fact, he called Zambia, China's newest province, and he was really, really acidic with the Chinese, and that's, I think, the time period that you're talking about there. And then later, when he came into power, he became very, very collaborative with the Chinese, and it's just funny how when he became president, his whole policy and outlook towards the Chinese changed. But when we talk about, and we're going to get to your research now, and I think because you were very, very specific in your criticisms, and this is what I enjoyed most about your papers, that you didn't really mince words. Unlike a lot of academics who kind of dance around the issues, you were specific, even calling out certain scholars by name for their kind of selective way of approaching the Chinese in Africa. So you say, for example, that a lot of the media coverage and the scholarly research characterizes Chinese as either, quote, scramblers or exploiters. And then you talk about the ethnic isolation that the Chinese have in Africa, and this is really one of the biggest criticisms from white people in particular about the Chinese in Africa, is that they don't assimilate, that they hide behind walled compounds, they're isolated from other ethnic groups, they're protected by private security guards, and they generally do not assimilate into the broader culture. And one of your arguments is that, well, in comparison in the context with Indians, South Africans, Lebanese, they're actually not anywhere near as egregious. And tell us a little bit about the research that you found and where the Chinese line up with those other ethnic groups.
Well, it seems from reading the literature and what some scholars have already done, it seems that they hardly compare their study with the Chinese and with the other ethnicities. And as you said, calling out the Chinese seems a little bit strange for me because, for example, having security guards at your home, digging your own wells is a very common thing for you to do in Zambia because the water system does not extend to all households, even to some more suburb area in Lusaka, the capital city. So it is very common for people to dig their own wells. And because of the high crime rate, people hire security guards, and not only exclusive to the Chinese. So I wanted to do a study to try to put the Chinese people back in context as to if we are criticizing the Chinese, we are commenting on the Chinese, how does this comment compare to other people? As in, if we ask the same question to the white people, Indians, Lebanese, and other African migrants in Zambia. So what's the answer? So that's sort of how my research was constructed. I wanted to compare different ethnicities.
It was very interesting to see, you not only compare different ethnicities, but also to compare them across a bunch of different areas, including personal relationships, and then also work relationships. I was surprised at how certain among the Chinese and other ethnicities landed in a lot of different places in these different areas. I wonder if you could give us the broad outline of some of your findings in relation to Zambian perceptions of these ethnicities.
Okay, so originally I wanted to know how Zambians perceive perceive the different, the non-indigenous ethnicities. So I chose 5 people. I would like to include more, but I don't want to annoy those who are doing the interview and who are doing the questionnaires. So I picked out the white people. This is the white people. I really don't like the word because the white people are worth many research topics within themselves. We have many kinds of white people, the older ones, the British Zambians, those from South African whites, and we also have new white people coming from Europe, US, Australia. And so, but from observation, it seems that white people in general do have a image in Zambia. So I have to tentatively include the white people, and obviously I want to include the Chinese, the Indian people, and then the Lebanese as well, because they are also an ethnicity that is being talked about, although not on a very large scale. And finally, South Africa, because I wanted to include another African country in the comparison, sort of as a control, or to see how this is placed within other continent who have migrants over here. So it seems that the results differ a little bit, but the general ethnic hierarchy, according to Zambian perception, is very stable. And the preliminary result is that the white people are on the top of the hierarchy, followed by the South Africans. And then you have the Chinese and the Indians almost at the same level, with the Chinese a little bit higher than the Indians. And then finally we have the Lebanese. So this is when I was coding the data, I didn't know what I was expecting. So it was not a surprise that the white people were on top, but I didn't know how the rest would fall. So right now I have this hierarchy in my data, and I'm trying to figure out why and try to explain that.
Just quickly, when you say South African, are you referring to South African white or South African black or both?
When I had when the question was laid out, I wasn't sure how the Zambian people would consider that. So I took the survey and I asked some subjects to how they perceive, and according to them, as long as they see white in there, they would include all the white people in there. And the South African, they would understand that as South African black people. But I feel that a lot of them also, because of South African is there, they consider both black and white people. So this is what happens here. I would criticize myself because it is not very. It can be a little bit misleading, but for this result, I think there should be further studies on how Zambian people perceive the white people in terms of Zambian white, new white people, and the South African white people. What came out in the results, fortunately for me, is that the white people and the South African people are next to each other in the hierarchy.
Cobus, did any of, let me ask you very quickly, did any of Yao's findings surprise you, particularly in terms of the placement of where the Chinese are obviously not at the top with the whites, but not at the bottom with the Lebanese in terms of Zambian perceptions? Were you surprised by any of the results?
I was very intrigued by them. I was surprised that the Chinese landed, roughly in the middle. Again, because as Yao has pointed out, the reporting about them is frequently seen completely in isolation. So one has no idea, kind of where they lie, and also the impression is that they're uniquely unpopular, which then turned out to not be true. What was also very surprising and intriguing to me is, and I actually want to ask Yao a little bit more about that, is it didn't seem to really correlate in relation to how long these populations have been in Zambia. Because as I understand, Indian populations have been in Zambia for a long time.
Right.
And, kind of there is a perception that Chinese populations or large-scale Chinese migration is much more recent. Did you see newness correlating at all in relation or perceptions of newness at all?
No, I didn't. I was in the National Archives and to see if there is any migration of other people, and it seems that I only found the earliest migration apart from the white people is the Indians, and after that you have a very long period when no new ethnicity came in. So I don't think it has anything. At least from my research, it has any correlation with the time that they have moved in. But I did try to interview some Zambian people and Indian people, and one Indian family that I interviewed, they are from a branch of Muslims who came in through northeastern Rhodesia in the 1905. So and their family have been around for generations, and they have all assimilated very well. But it seems that this is their own life and their own perception. But the Zambian perception to them is not very connected.
I want to make sure we have time to address probably the most visible issue in this story, which is the labor situation and the working conditions. A lot of people may have seen coverage of the Chinese in Zambia because of instances like the violence that occurred at the mines. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was at the Kolum mine where Zambian workers kind of rebelled against the Chinese owners. A Chinese manager brought out a shotgun, fired not into the crowd, but off the ground, and a shell then hit, somebody and injured them. That got an enormous amount of international press. And then your colleagues or your professors and mentors in Hong Kong, Barry Soutman and Yen Hai Rong, subsequently did some research which kind of really explained that although the Chinese are getting these awful headlines, when you put them in the context of labor relations, particularly with white-owned companies, the Chinese are actually not the worst. And then you're now doing research on this very subject, and it seems to be that you're confirming that as well. Talk to us a little bit about the situation with labor and the mines in particular in Zambia, because that seems to be a flashpoint, particularly in the eyes of Westerners.
As much as I would like to address the mines, I'm not an expert on that. I have been to Kitwe and have spoken to some of the managers and people in there, but it was only on a few occasions. So I don't think I have enough expertise to comment on that. But in terms of labor relations compared to the white people, the Indians, I would say that my idea to compare different kinds of ethnicity is inspired by Barry and Hai Rong's studies in their works in the mines. And in terms of labor relations, if we only ask the question to how the Chinese companies are doing in the violent incidents and so on, I think a more in context study would be to ask the same questions to other companies. And what is your definition of a Chinese company? Is it an international Chinese company? Is it a state-owned enterprise? Is it a personal, individual, family business in there? These are all on very different levels. And if you only use the word Chinese, it's we don't really have much context. So I've also done some research on the labor relations for the Chinese and the Zambians, Lebanese and Zambians, and whites and Zambians, and I've also heard and encountered some conflicts in these cases. So, my general perception is that we have to tell the whole story if we're telling a story.
You should teach journalism.
One of the key questions that your work really, I think, raises is we've heard this. It's almost become a cliche in China-Africa coverage that the Chinese keep themselves apart. They don't integrate. They never want to integrate. And I think your study really starts questioning the concept of integration itself, kind of starting to ask and starting to almost quantify what does it actually mean to be integrated into African society as a minority population. And the point that you also make in the paper is that, kind of, for example, Chinese would be criticized for having security guards and for digging their own wells. And then you point out, yes, lots of people in Zambia do that anyway, and lots of minority populations all do that. Did you get a glimpse so far of what Zambians what do they mean by integration, and what would a fully integrated minority life in Zambia actually look like?
Every Zambian person I have interviewed, I asked them to define what is Zambian culture. And they each gave me very different answers. And there are some more globalized views and some more traditional views. I asked them, what is Zambian culture? Is it the traditional culture that you find in rural areas, in the tribal areas? Is it a more urban life that has influence from the West, that has the Western education, and that has a lot of Muslim and Hindu presence? Would you call that Zambian culture as well? Because we have a very huge, because Zambia is a Christian country, but we have a lot of Muslim and Hindu and other religions here, and the Muslim people sort of also confined to their own community, but would you say they have integrated or not? So everyone give me different answers to that. But in general, Zambian people, those who I've talked to, are very happy to contain new ideas and new cultures within them, and they're also very willing to learn new kinds of cultures. They have, in many instances, my Zambian interviewees have said, well, we have over 70 ethnicities within our own country, the indigenous ones, so we are always a welcoming country. So I guess in response to your country, I personally, I don't know what it's like to have a fully integrated Zambian life. I guess different people have different measurements. So I'm trying to come up with some common measurements in terms of work, culture, and culture is a very big word, and also in terms of eating, marriage, and in resolving conflicts, in equality, legal perspectives. I'm trying to see what could be some measurements of integration.
Cobus, I think there's also a certain degree of white privilege that goes on in this discussion. White people, for the most part, in Africa, here in Asia, other parts of the world, I don't really hear this question of the, do they assimilate or do they not? And the irony was that when I used to live in Kinshasa, white aid workers would sit around in their, literally, in their $100,000 Land Rovers in walled compounds with their satellite TV, their food flown in. I mean, it's just the most obscene thing you've ever seen. And are hurling the kind of accusations towards the Chinese about not assimilating or acculturating. And you're just kind of like, you're just in some parallel universe. And when the media coverage of whites around the world, again, we don't see that pressure on us. I certainly don't have the pressure here in Vietnam to assimilate or to acculturate when other ethnicities do. And I think that's very interesting to kind of see this ethnic and racial relativism that comes into this discussion. And it's particularly relevant when we look at the international media coverage with either journalists who are based outside of Africa who fly in and kind of bring up these narratives that Yao is kind of talking about, which are out of context, or by whites oftentimes and who are in Africa, who they themselves have not done a good job of assimilating. And if we talk about a basic definition of assimilation or acculturation, the way I look at it is speaking the language is really very important. Do you kind of buy your food in the same places that other people buy their food? Or do you buy at kind of expensive supermarkets that are isolated if you're a foreign expat, for example, or an aid worker, whatnot? Or do you kind of isolate yourself behind the walls in your own compounds, as the Chinese often do? So I think language and religion and just spending time in this and going out into the culture, putting your children into local schools, those are all the kind of the check boxes of assimilation. But Cobus, I'd be interested to get your take on kind of my accusations and my hurling of insults towards the Western press and whites for their criticism of the Chinese.
No, I definitely share those problems. I think there's a lot of these kind of misperceptions, are very convenient misperceptions, are kind of come up through Western press, because of course it takes the issue of white versus black, which is still a key flashpoint in African life and politics. It takes that off the table, and it makes kind of like white Westerners feel great, kind of because they're not being accused of anything. But I tend to want to actually kind of want to move the conversation actually away from white privilege a little bit, because I am a little bit afraid that it takes black, not to sound too academic, but it takes black subjectivity off the table and refocuses the conversation on whiteness. So what I'm very interested in is really the core of what Yao's work is moving towards, which is really what do black people think about these situations, right? Which my feeling is that kind of talking about white privilege tends to, again, refocus it away from that issue. And it's very interesting, kind of, I think South Africa presents an even more complicated challenge to the ideas of integration that you've set up, because in South Africa, lots of people of all kinds of races, including a majority of black people, live behind high walls. A lot of them shop at swanky supermarkets, or don't necessarily, even if they don't necessarily shop at markets. Kind of there's all of these different kind of ways of living that would in other parts of Africa define the elite versus the normal people. In South Africa, it breaks down in more complicated ways. And so, and also I think a different thing is in South Africa, there isn't this clear break between local language and colonial language. I had a fascinating discussion with some of my students who are all young black women. And I asked them literally about Chinese integration in South Africa. And one of them said she has massive problems with seeing Chinese writing on signs. She wants English. And I'm like, it was then up to me, the white guy in the room, going, yeah, English is a colonial language. But South Africa is part of the Anglophone world, and black South Africans are part of the Anglophone world. And so it weirdly, what in the mouth of a Donald Trump supporter would be the worst kind of racist nativism becomes a weird kind of Africanist, Pan-African, kind of a now anti-Chinese thing to say. It's dizzyingly complicated, and this is actually why Yao's work is so valuable, I think.
It is exactly why Yao's work is so valuable. Yao, where do you take this? Where do you go? It seems like your paper was not very long, which was great for us because we could get through it. Sometimes the academic papers are unbearably long, so I was quite grateful. But it seems like this is just the start for a deeper survey into the subject of kind of racial identity and race relations and ethnic relations and cultural relations and assimilation and acculturation, all those great words in Zambia. What's the next step for you?
Well, the next step is definitely to try to understand and explain the reasons for Zambian people's perception. We might be looking into the colonial history, might be looking into the migration history, on why this sort of ethnic hierarchy has been built, and it's been quite stable. And we would distribute surveys we did it in 3 cities, and they all come up quite similar to each other. It's a stable image in the perception of the urban Zambian people, or at least according to our survey. So I want to know why, for example, the Lebanese people coming into the bottom is quite a surprise, and I'm trying to explain that and see what are the reasons that the Lebanese have made a quite a negative image compared to the other ethnicities. And also, I think a very interesting topic for me is also to compare the Chinese people and the Indian people. And when I was in the archives, and I was reading some letters and exchanges between the British South Africa Company and the African Lakes Company in terms of whether they should allow Indian traders to come into Zambia. They had a very interesting conversation, and a lot of the words that's used 100 years ago has been used today on the Chinese people as they are coming in. So I think that's very fascinating. And a third point is on a study on the white people. I think the white people and even the colored people in the community, the whole community in Africa, is also worth many research topics. It's been because amongst themselves there are many. They have very different migration stories and their accumulation stories, and in terms of their religions and cultures. I think it's also unfair to categorize every Caucasian population as a white. And so these are a few directions that I can think of that Fantastic. I will be doing.
Well, Lu Yao is a master's student in social sciences at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. We will share some of her findings from her recent work on our website in the show page and some of the links to where you're getting this show. So if you want to see her work that she's done, it's very, very exciting. And I think for us, it's also exciting because we're starting to see a new generation of scholars come up through the ranks and academics doing some really exciting research. Just over the past few weeks, we've done shows with a number of scholars in their 20s, and they're coming at these stories with whole new, different approaches than an older generation. And I think both Cobus and I are thrilled to kind of see that happen. So, Lu Yao, thank you so much for joining us today. Congratulations on your paper, and we're really excited to follow your work in the coming months and years.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. And Cobus and I will be back again very soon with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadanesk, or Eric at EOlander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.